In this video, we'll be looking at how to incorporate a Bootstrap 5 table populated with data from the random user API into our React application. So stick around and I'll show you how to do it. Hey guys, how's it going and welcome to the channel. If you like the content of this video, please give it a like, share and add a comment in the comments below and hit that subscribe button and bell icon. Now back to the video. Okay, so let's take a look at the application we're going to be building. As you can see, we've got a Bootstrap 5 table and it's been populated with data from the random user API. When we click on a user, that user is shown in the component below. And when we refresh the page, we get another set of users. And that's it. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is create our new React application. And we can do that by typing npx create React app and then the name of our application, which I'm going to call React Bootstrap 5 table, and hitting enter. Now that'll take a few minutes to install, so I'll pause the video there. Okay, so that's now completed. It's downloaded and installed all the relevant packages to get our initial application up and running. So we can cd into the application folder that's just been created. So that's React Bootstrap 5 table and hit enter. And then we can type code dot to bring up VS Code. And as you can see, we're now in our newly created application. So we can close this Get Started page and we can open up a terminal window. And then we can type npm start and head on over to a browser window where we should see our initial application running on localhost 3000. So the next thing that we need to do is to delete some of the boilerplate files that were downloaded when we created our application, as we're not going to need them for what we're building. So if we open our src folder, we can remove app.css, app.test, index.css, logo, report web vitals, and set up tests files. And then what we need to do is remove the references to those files that we've just deleted. So in our app.js file, we can remove these import lines. And in our index.js file, we need to remove this line, this line, this line, and we can get rid of these comments. Back in our app.js file, we can also remove all of this. And we can replace that with a h1 tag and the name of our app. Then if we head back to the browser window, we can see that we've just got the title of our application running on localhost 3000. So the next thing we need to do is to install Bootstrap. So if we jump back into VS Code and we open up another terminal window and we can type npm install Bootstrap and hit enter. So that's installed, and we can just check by going into our package.json file and we can see that Bootstrap 5.2 has been installed correctly. So we can close that. So the next thing we need to do is to go into our index.js file and we need to import Bootstrap because we've installed it but we've not actually imported it into our application. So I'm just going to paste in this line, and what that's doing is that's importing the Bootstrap CSS file, which will allow us to style our application using Bootstrap CSS. So now if we head back to our browser window, we can see that we've now got the Bootstrap styling applied to our h1 tag. The next step is to create all the components that we'll need for our application, and we'll do that next. Okay, so we now need to create our components which will make up our application. So if we go into the SRC folder, and we create a new folder and call that components, and hit enter. Then within that, we need to create our parent component, which is users. We also need our table component, which will hold all the records coming from the API. And finally, we need our user component, which will display the record for the user that has just been clicked on in the table. And we can use our snippet, RAFCE, to create some basic code for each of these components. So we'll do the same for table, RAFCE, and the same for users, RAFCE. Now, one other thing I want to do just at this stage is to, in our app component, I want to bring in the users component. So to do that, we need to get rid of this H1 line now, and we can just bring in our users. If we hit enter, that should auto import. And now if we head back to our browser window, we should see that our users component is now being displayed. And what we can do as well is we can, within our users component, we can actually bring in our table and our user component. So we'll do that now. And we just need to surround that with a fragment. And again, if we head back to our browser window, we've actually got a users component which wraps around the table and user component. Right, so what we need to do now is to write the code which will fetch our data from the API. And to do that, we first need to install a third-party package called axios. And we can use this then to retrieve our data. But first, as we've installed it, we now need to import it. And then we need to create the function which will fetch our data for us. So if we use the snippet nfn, that creates our function structure, and we're going to call this fetch users data. This is going to be an asynchronous function, so we need to put async in front of this. We're not passing in any parameters, but what we are going to do is we're going to use a try catch to catch any errors if for any reason it can't get the data. So we actually need to store the data in a variable when it comes back. And because we're using async, we need to use await, and then we can use our axios with a get request to our endpoint. And I'm just going to paste that in. This is the address for the random user API. And then all we want to do now is to console log the result. So to actually call this function, this fetch users data function, we need to use useEffect. So if we bring that in, and then we can now use the use effect hook down here. So if we use the snippet, and we can remove this, and we can remove this, and then we need to call that function. So it's fetch user data. And if we save that, and then go back to our browser, refresh the application, we can see that we get an object. And that object has our data results, which is our 5 random users. So that's great. That's exactly what we want. And one thing we need to remember to do is to do something with the error if for any reason it can't retrieve the data. So all we're going to do here is just console log the error out. Now, in order to use the data that's coming back from the API, we need to store it somewhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to use useState, and then we can use the useState snippet to set up our state. So we're going to call this users, and to begin with, it's just going to be an empty array. Now, going back to our application, we want to look at this object because we want to understand what we're actually trying to store. So remember, we've got an object and it's got this data attribute, and then it's also got results in it. So this is the array that we want to try and capture. So it's data results. We can see that we're using this res, but in actual fact, we want it to be res.data.results. And then if we go back to our browser, we can now see that we're getting just the array of these users, these 5 users. And that's what we want to be storing in the useState value users. So again, back to VS Code, and we can remove this now and replace it with set users. And then what we can do is pass the users as a prop into our table component. So we'll look at our table component next. Right, so if we go into our table component, we see we've got nothing in there at the minute, just this div with the word table in it. And what we want to do is bring in a Bootstrap 5 table component. So we'll head over to Bootstrap's website. Under docs, we can come down to content and hit tables. And I'm just going to grab the first one. So if we copy this and then head back to VS Code, and we can replace this div with the table that we just copied. And if we jump back to our application, we can take a quick look at what the table looks like. So as you can see, it's been populated with some data, but that data is hard coded, and what we want to do is bring in the data from the users prop. So let's go back into VS Code, and we can start by bringing in the users prop. Let's just close this so we've got a bit more room. So instead of us having these table rows, and we've got 3 of them here, what we want to do is map through our users and create a row for each user. So we can start by doing users.map, and we can have the user and also the index. And then we can copy one of these table rows and place it in there. Now we can get rid of all of these. And let's just console log the users just to remind ourselves of what the actual data structure looks like, so we know what we want to pull out from it. Let's jump back into our app. So what we need is the email. Then under login, we need the username. And then under name, we also need the first and the last names. So we can see we can get that data from this object. So if we jump back into VS Code, we can change this that can become username. And this one becomes email. And then in here, we can then say, for the first one, we want user.login.username. For this one is going to be user.name.first. And for this one is going to be user.name.last. And then we need one more field, which will just be user.email. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And as you can see, it's brought in the username, the first and last names, and the email address for each user. And if we hit the refresh button, it should bring in a different set of users. Right, so now we just need to address these warnings. So this is the one where we need to change all the references to class name, because React doesn't use the word class. And this one is basically saying that each record, so each one of these, must have a unique identifier, which is called the key prop. So let's go into VS Code and fix those. So the first thing I want to do is change this class. Now there's only one, so it's just class name. So that should have fixed that warning. And then the second thing is that each row, so remember we're mapping through the users, so we've got 5 rows to map through. Each row needs a unique identifier. We do that by giving it a key prop, and we can give that the value of the index, because we know that it's going to assign each row the index value. So it will go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 for our 5 records. But what we want to actually display is index plus 1. So back to our browser window again, and we can see now that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if we refresh the page, we've also got rid of those warnings now. Now, one other thing that I want to do is to come back into VS Code, and where we gave this a key, this table row a key, I also wanted to give it the role of a button. It's just a small thing, but it's good to show the user that this table row is actually clickable. And I'll show you what I mean. So we can see that we've now got an arrow as our cursor, but if we go over a row, it changes to the pointer, which is typical button behavior. So this is indicating that this is a clickable field. Now nothing's happening because we've not assigned an event handler to it. So we can do that now. On our table row, we want to add an on-click event. And what we need to do is we need to create a function which calls a handle user on click function, which passes in the user. But what we want to do here is we want to bring this function in as a prop. So we want to bring it in here from the parent component, which is actually the users component. So if we go into users, we can add this function here. So we'll use our snippet, nfn, and we'll go handle user on click, it takes in the user, and for now we'll just console log out that user. And then we just need to remember to pass that into the table component as a prop. So handle user on click, and that's going to equal handle user on click. So let's take a look at that. And if we refresh the page and then we click on one of the users, you can see it's console logging out the user object. So we can see this is the first user. Click the second one. We can see it's changed to the second user, and that's what we want. Now the last thing that I want to do in the table component is to just add a little bit of styling. So let's jump back into VS Code. And if we go into our table component, and then under table, I want to just add some extra classes here. These are all Bootstrap classes. So I want to add table, bordered, table, hover, and table primary. And that'll just add a bit of styling to our table. You can see it's got this nice hover effect now. So the last thing in the table component I want to do is just remove this console log, as we don't need to see the users now in the console log. And I'll just save it so it formats it better. So that's our table component complete. And the next thing that we want to do is look at our user component. Now remember, we're passing in this handle user on click function into our table component from our users component. All this is currently doing is just console logging out the user that's being clicked. What we need to do is to save that user into our state. So we'll do that now. So we can create another piece of state using the useState snippet. And we'll call it current user, because that's what we want to capture, the current user. And we'll give that an initial value of null. And then we can come down to our console log and replace this with set current user. So when the user record is clicked now, it will save that user into our current user state. Then what we can do is pass that into our user component. But one thing we need to check is that we have actually got a current user. So if we haven't got a current user, i.e. when the application first launches, we'll get an error if the user component tries to render. So we need to ensure a user's been clicked in the table. So to do that, we need to put some logic around it. So I'm going to say current user. So if there is a current user, then render the user component. Else, render nothing. And that will prevent us from getting an error in our application. So in our user component, the first thing we need to do is bring in that current user piece of state from the props. So current user. And then we can destructure that to bring out the properties. So we can get the name, the login, and the picture. And that equals the current user. Then if we head back to Bootstrap's web page, and in docs, we're looking for the card component. And we're going to grab this first one here. So we can hit copy, and then we can jump back into VS Code, and we can now get rid of this div, and we can paste in that component. And we need to replace the class references with class name. So now we can use these destructured values, what we've created here. So our name, our login, and our picture. And we're going to use them here. So in the image, we want to get rid of this. And we can go picture dot large. In the card title, we can get rid of this. And we can put in the login dot username. And then in the text, we can get rid of this. And we can replace it with name.first and name.last. We don't need the link, but what we do need to do is we need to change this so it's done in a way that React can understand. And it's giving us a clue there that the style prop value must be an object. So we need to create an object. And I'm just going to change that to 12. And now if we head back to our browser, we should be able to see our user being presented. And if we hit refresh, we get the new set of users. So that's all up and working. And the last thing that we need to do is just to apply some styling to bring this all into the center. And we'll do that now. So in our user component, we can actually remove this fragment. We don't need that because we've got a parent div. The table component's got a parent table tag. So in the users component, we want to create a div with a class name of container. And then we're just going to change this to a h3 tag. And then back to our application in the browser window, we can now see that it's moved the whole app into a more central position. And we can still click through our users and also refresh the page to get a new set of users. And that's it. So we've now got a Bootstrap 5 table component which takes in data from the random user API working in our React application. Hope you've enjoyed the video and you can take something from it, and don't forget, if you like the content of this video, please give it a like, share and add a comment in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button and bell icon. And I'll see you in the next one.